Genesis chapter 4, the story of Cain and Abel. This is, of course, one of the most famous stories about the first murder, right, in biblical history. And it's also the first example of a very prominent theme throughout Genesis and indeed the whole Bible, and that is of sibling rivalry. If we recollect many of the famous stories, and we'll try to go according to the order, we can see in Genesis alone the story of Isaac and Ishmael, and then the story of Jacob and Esau, and then the story of Jacob's two wives, Leah and Rachel, and continuing onwards, we see the sons of Jacob, Joseph and his brothers, and in the book of Judges, we have the story of the sons of Gideon, Avimelech, and Yotam, and we continue onwards. David and his brothers, we have and the sons of David, right? We have constant, right, an ongoing tension between brothers. But it's not only a theme of sibling rivalry. We find something else that's common and shared by almost all these stories, and that is the intriguing fact that in all stories, even though there's tension and jealousy, it's pretty much constantly that we find that the eldest is not chosen, but rather the elected is either the youngest or one of the younger brothers. This motif of, we'll call it the diselection of the firstborn, the eldest, is found not only in stories of sibling rivalry, but even in stories where the brothers get along. And we'll just go through the stories and point it out. Right in our story of Cain and Abel, well, Cain is the older brother, but Abel's offering is accepted while Cain's, as we will see, is rejected. Later on, it's Isaac and Ishmael, but Ishmael is the eldest, is the firstborn, but Isaac, who was born to Sarah later on, he's the elected. The two sons that are born to Isaac and Rebekah are Esav, and Jacob. And of course, Jacob is the younger one, holding grasping onto the heel of Esau as they came out. Even the two wives of Jacob, Leah is the eldest, but Jacob loves Rachel. And also, of course, in the famous story of Joseph and his brothers, well, out of the 12 brothers, it's clear that Reuben, the firstborn, is not elected, but rather the younger brothers, whether it be Judah or Joseph himself. And interestingly, even when Joseph brings his two sons, who seem to get along, right, brings them before Jacob to get a blessing, it's actually Ephraim, the younger brother, who's given the more elevated blessing rather than Manasseh, the older brother. And we find this also, for example, in the relationship between Moses and Aaron, who get along well, but it's actually Moses, the younger brother, who is the leader. And interestingly enough, if we move forward, the first king actually comes from the smallest tribe, the youngest of the tribes, Benjamin. Saul, the first king of Israel, comes from the tribe of Benjamin. And David, who inherits Saul and takes his place, is actually the youngest of the brothers of the sons born to Yishai, Jesse, right? The prophet Samuel believed that it's actually Eliab, the firstborn, who was the elected, but God basically corrects him and says, no, it's not him. And we realize it's the youngest of the sons, David. And who inherits David? Well, it's his youngest son, Shlomo, Solomon, and not the older brothers who are basically diselected or murdered for that in that case. So what we see here is a common, ongoing theme, not only of sibling rivalry, but actually of we'll call it the non-election of the firstborn. And this is too consistent to be accidental. It's, I think, purposeful and holds a message and an idea. And the idea that I proposed that stands behind this, including our story, is that the perspective on leadership and election in the Bible is one that holds that election is not predetermined. Status is not an issue of birth. There's no birthright to be a leader, but rather election is an outcome of one's actions, one's character. And counter to what we find in other cultures where there's the concept of primogenitor, the firstborn, the status, the preferred status of the firstborn, comes the Bible and shows, no, it's not the firstborn who is elected. He may have some economic privileges as far as inheritance, but he has definitely no advantage as far as status and election. If anything, it seems like most of the firstborn are not elected, right? Rather, as we've seen, it's mostly either the youngest or one of the younger brothers who is, right? And I believe that this idea, which is going counter to what we find in many ancient cultures, for example, ancient Indian culture, where status is determined by birth, the different castes, right? Your birth already determines your status in society. The Bible doesn't hold by that and says, no, status is determined by your own actions and character. And this may also have something to do with the election of Israel, for counter to what we're used to thinking now, Israel is an ancient society. It is now, but in the biblical times, it was a new startup nation, right? God is now, all right, setting the stage for the election of a new people. And this is in the background of these ancient empires, whether it be Egypt or Babylon, Mesopotamia, right? Hittites, Assyrians, all these ancient nations. And suddenly this startup nation has the claim of being elected according to the Bible. The Bible wishes to, I guess, state that election, whether it be on the individual level or on the national level, it's not an outcome of antiquity, right, or age, but rather God looks and determines. And in the case of Israelites, he found the patriarchs to be worthy of elections and to be the forefathers of the chosen nation. So our first example is, of course, in our story, Cain and Abel. And we'll begin by just pointing out how short this narrative is. It's actually one chapter long, and even in this one chapter, chapter 4, there's actually the story of Cain and Abel, which is pretty much half a chapter, and then there's a tangent that goes on to describe the descendants of Cain, right? So it's actually very short a narrative, particularly if, for example, by contrast, we compare it to a modern day novel that had the title Cain and Abel, authored by Jeffrey Archer's 1979, 1980 novel, bestseller. And of course, the title reveals that it deals with tension between two characters, Cain and Cain spelled differently, but obviously referring to an analogy to the biblical Cain and Abel. But by contrast, that novel is over 500 pages long. So this is a nice example of the elliptical, short nature of biblical narrative. And that, of course, obliges us to pay close attention to every detail in such a small narrative. So first, let's try to get an overview of the structure of the story. Like I said, it spans one chapter long, and this determination of the borders arises from the content that we see. And like I said, there is a tangent on the way, right, where the half of the chapter deals with the descendants of Cain, but nevertheless, the story comes back in full circle and kind of has a frame structure. So let's show it in the verses themselves. We see the beginning of the story, the description of the birth. Here we have Genesis chapter 4. the mention of the birth of Cain first in the first verse, right? Here's Cain. In the second verse, we have Abel mentioned, right? And the end of the story, the end of chapter 4, going down right here, we see the last verses, verse 25, we have mention of another son born, right? Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and called him Seth. This is the third son, and then Seth also has an offspring by the name of Enosh, right? So we begin the story with the description of the birth of sons to Adam and Eve, and we conclude the story with the birth of another son and then his son as well. Right, so that kind of brings the story full circle. And if we want to try to identify a certain structure behind the narrative, so I want to propose the following. I think we can see kind of a chiastic structure behind the story. And here I'll share it with you. We open up with the birth of sons, and we close with another son and his son at the end of the story. The second stage, after the description of the birth of the sons, is the bringing of offerings to God by both of them. Right, and then we have a dialogue after Cain's offering is rejected, and only Abel's is accepted. So we have a dialogue between God and Cain, where basically God encourages and also warns Cain to not fall into depression, but keep on trying. Then we get to the heart of the story, the verse 8, which describes the murder of Abel by Cain. And then we have a second dialogue between God and Cain, where God inquires and then punishes Cain for his actions. And then the fulfillment of that punishment is in the next stage. And we have Cain basically being ejected from his land and going into exile, right? And then we have description of his descendants, his offspring, 7 generations going down. And then we have the closure of the story. We return to the parents, Adam and Eve, and the birth of another son, Seth. So if we look closely, we can identify here a certain chiastic structure, birth compared to birth. We have a dialogue before the murder and a second dialogue between God and Cain after the murder. And the second and second to last involved first an attempt to get close to God by bringing an offering, and then a distancing of Cain from God, where he's exiled, punished, and sent into exile, and therefore kind of like a distancing between them. So we can see certain aspects contrast clearly with regard to getting close, trying to get close to God, and the tragic outcome of being exiled and being distanced by God in the second and second to last. Even if we compare the two dialogues, the first dialogue is one of an attempt to help, to encourage, right, Cain not to give up, whereas the second dialogue is one of punishment. So there we also have a contrast between the dialogues. As far as the birth, well, I guess we'll leave that for our analysis, but I will try to show that there's even an aspect of contrast if we compare the birth at the end of the story compared to the birth in the beginning. So we have here an overview where obviously the turning point and the heart of the story and the cause for all this contrast and dramatic change is the murder. So before we start analyzing the actual story itself, I want to remind us that we have to keep an eye on every detail here. And the big question is, how does such a short narrative build up tension in a matter of 7 verses towards a murder, right? If the murder would be the highlight, the climax of the story, well, in a modern day novel, that would take a good 100 pages at least, and if not more. And here we're talking about 7 verses. How does the story build up tension towards the murder? So let's now look into the story itself. We'll analyze it and see different aspects that build up the tension towards the central verse of the murder. Okay, so we go back to the top and we'll read. And the man, that is Adam, knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, and said, I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord. So here we have the birth and also giving of a name and an explanation of the name. The English readers don't pick up on the connection between the explanation and the name itself. But in the Hebrew, in the original, one can see the connection because it says, Vateled et Cain, and she gave birth, right, to Cain, right, and bore Cain. And then she says, Kaniti Ishet Hashem. Translate, I have gotten a man, right? Kaniti, liknot, to buy. But note the similarity between the name Cain and Kaniti. Very similar sound, Cain, Kaniti, and that's the explanation. The first case of pregnancy, and the parents probably don't know exactly what to expect, right? Eve is putting on some weight, and suddenly, comes out a human, and her reaction is, I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord. I've acquired a man or gotten a man, kaniti, right? So it's an expression of surprise about the birth, that there's a new human here. And she connects that with the help of the Lord, she has given birth to another human being, right? The great, right, marvel of a birth of a human. So we have the first birth, and we continue on, and again she bore his brother Abel. Now, as we read, we immediately have a sense of asymmetry, a lack of symmetry, because while the name of the second son is given, Abel, what's obviously lacking is the explanation. There's no explanation. And she said, why Cain? Because Kaniti, I have gotten a man. But here, there's no explanation. There's just a mention of the name. And this already creates a sense of tension, a lack of symmetry in the story. There's no equilibrium here between the brothers. Indeed, if we ask why the name Abel, it seems to be presented as kind of a riddle, right? You ask why Abel, well, you'll find out later. And for the answer, you also have to know the meaning of the name in the Hebrew. The Hebrew, Hevel, right, means air or nothingness. Hevel Havelim, right, vanity or nothingness. And then, since we already know the continuation of the story, that Abel will be murdered, so we can already explain what, as far as from a narrative perspective, not as far as the original intent of the name as it was given by the parents, but rather from a narrative perspective, he is called Hevel, Abel, because he will disappear like air. He will be nothing, right? He won't have continued existence. But like I said, as far as this stage in the story, we have a sense of asymmetry, imbalance here. No explanation given for the name Abel. We continue onwards. And Abel was a keeper of sheep, right? It's a literal translation of a shepherd. V'cain haya oved adama. And interestingly, the English translation translated the vav, which is usually and, as but. Cain was a tiller of the ground, right? One who works the soil, works the ground. Now here we have basically a description of the professions, of their occupations. One is a shepherd and one is a farmer. Note that in the Hebrew we have actually quite a symmetrical linguistic parallel here of a verb and a noun. Ro'eh tzon, which was translated a keeper of sheep, and oved adama, a verb and a noun, a tiller of the ground, right? So we have two professions, occupations, in which the name is formed of a verb and a noun, keeper of sheep, tiller of ground, right? So there seems to be a symmetry here in the description of professions. But nonetheless, of course, there's tension between them because of the contrast between these two occupations. They're diametrically opposed as far as their nature, where a shepherd, of course, is a vagabond, constantly traveling from grazing land to another one, in the shift of the seasons, also moving from place to place. Whereas the farmer, the tiller of soil, has his own plot of land and he's totally focused on a specific area. So we have already a kind of an inborn tension or a contrast between the two occupations. But it's not only a contrast, it's also indeed tension, because anybody who knows history of conflict, there's always been tension between nomadic tribes and agrarian society, right? You can find it in tensions between Mongolian herdsmen and tribesmen with the Chinese agricultural society, right? In fact, you find it to this day. If you look in the Negev, right, in southern Israel, there's tension between the Bedouin shepherds and nomads, if you will, and the kibbutzim and moshavim, the farming societies, where there's a lot of tension between them. So these are two occupations that are dramatically different in their nature. And not only that, but they're also fundamentally at odds, because, the shepherd who enters a certain field, a vegetable field, a lettuce field with his herd of sheep, well, very quickly there's nothing left of his field, and all his work goes down the tubes. Nothing is left. So there's always been tension between the two. Not surprisingly, we find this as well. So this is a second, I think, example of tension buildup here, not only in the asymmetry of the names, but rather the diametrically opposed and actually conflicting occupations of the two brothers. That brings us to verse 3. In the process of time, it came to pass that Cain brought of the fruit of the ground an offering to the Lord. So Cain here comes with an initiative as a farmer. We saw that Cain was a tiller of the ground, right? So now he brings from his fruit of the ground as an offering. And in verse 4, and Abel, he also brought of the firstlings of his flock, of the fat thereof. So here again, we see the description of both brothers, basically performing an act of bringing an offering to God. And once again, we have that vav, that letter that combines, but inconsistently. In this instance, they actually translated and, which I think is unfortunate, because in my opinion, once again, here we have a contrast between the two, right? Just like earlier in the previous verse, they translated it with the word but, right? That vav conjunction. It's not and, it might be but in contrast. And so too here, I think we have a contrast. And you ask what contrast? They both bring from their produce, right? But if we look closely, we can see that there's also, once again, a contrast between the two. Because whereas Cain, who was the initiator, who brought, it only states that he brought of the fruit of the ground, without any description of what the nature of the fruit that he brought. Compare that to Abel. He also brought, but what did he bring? He didn't bring only of his flock, but rather firstlings of his flocks and of the fat thereof, the choicest pieces, right? So here, once again, we have asymmetry. In this instance, as far as the description of the offering, note these very minute details, but they're all of importance, right? And this once again creates an imbalance. Cain just brought from his fruit, but Abel brought from the firstlings of his flocks, the firstborn of his flocks, and the fat thereof, the choicest, right, the best of his sheep. right? And of course, this is a first example of an idea that we find later on in the whole field of sacrifices in the book of Leviticus, particularly, but as an aspect of worship of God in which there's emphasis on bringing first, right? First of the flocks and the choicest, the best portions. And I believe that this also is a hint towards why God accepted, right, the offering of Abel and not that of Cain, right? Look at the continuation of verse 4. And the Lord had respect unto Abel, right? He heeded Abel's offering, right? And to his offering, but unto Cain and his offering, he had no respect. He didn't accept the offering of Cain. Why is that? Why did God accept only Abel, the younger brother's offering, and not Cain, who was the initiator, who was the first to bring? I think that's hinted in the contrast of the description. Now, I'm not saying that Cain brought bad fruit, spoiled fruit, but he didn't bring the first fruit. And he didn't bring the choicest, the largest ones. Perhaps he wanted it for himself. The first fruit he was connected to. The nicest fruit, he said, well, that one I want to save for myself, right? But he brought fruit. But Abel felt that if he brings an offering to his God, to the Creator, who provides us with all, then it has to be the firstling, right? You have to bring the first. What's the idea of bringing firstlings, which we find in many commandments, to bring first fruits, right? Also the first birth, even firstborn of humans. Jews have the command to basically free the firstborn by paying a certain symbolic amount of money to the priest, the Kohen, right, in order to buy back your firstborn, showing that as if the firstborn really belongs to God. This is called Pidyon Bechorot, the freeing of the firstborn, right? Symbolic kind of act that's performed when if your firstborn is a son, right? Then there, and he's the first to come out of the womb, then there is that command. The idea here is that everything that is first belongs to God. And by giving the first, by giving the first fruit or the firstborn, you recognize that and you proclaim, I know that everything comes from God, and therefore I give the first to God. And he doesn't only bring the first, which is an important central idea in offerings and sacrifices and commitment, but he also brings the choicest, right? And that's another concept that the worship of God involves giving the best, right? There's a concept in performing commandments that you have to embellish them. In Hebrew, it's called hidur, right? Mehadrin. You do it in the best way, right? In many different commandments, like taking the 4 species on Sukkot. So you take, right, a citron, an etrog, right, has to be a beautiful fruit that you bring, that you take, right? The whole idea, and also in other holidays like Hanukkah, we light many candles to show that we're doing it in a most dignified and beautiful way. So here we see, I think, God accepting Abel because he saw how Abel really worshipped God with all his heart, right? With the best that he had. Whereas Cain, even though he initiated the idea of bringing an offering, he didn't give the best to God, and hence God didn't accept, right, Cain's offering, but he did heed and accept Abel's offering. So here, once again, we have a second example of asymmetry in the description of the bringing of the offerings. And then, of course, we have the contrast as far as God's response, right? Where he heeded and respected Abel's offering in the end of verse 4. But, and here once again, we see the word but unto Cain and to his offering, he had no respect. In other words, he didn't accept Cain's offering. So that's the fourth example of tension. Here, obviously, the contrast between God's reaction to the different offerings. And the outcome of this is Cain's response. And Cain was very wroth, very angered, right, and hurt by this. and his countenance fell. Basically, he was depressed and felt very down as a consequence of his offering not being accepted. I want to also bring a fifth example of tension buildup, and that relates to the ordering of the different the different names of the characters as they are mentioned in the narrative, because we find that they're always mentioned in pairs, but if you look closely, the ordering is actually constantly changing. First, we have the birth of Cain, right, and then we have Abel. So it's Cain and Abel, right? And then in the second part of verse 2, in the description of their occupations, we actually have, once again, both of them mentioned, but Abel first and then Cain second. And then as far as the bringing of the offerings, once again, we have Cain first and Abel second. And as far as God's response to the offerings, God first heeds Abel's offering, but not Cain's. So it flips up again, right? What do we find here? They're always mentioned in the first 4.5 verses. They're mentioned as pairs, but if you look closely, you find that the ordering constantly flips. Here, let's present it right here. You see it? Cain, Abel, Abel, Cain. Cain, Abel, Abel, Cain. Consistently, if you look in the first 4.5 verses. What's behind this? So is it just a matter of, okay, the verse picking up the last name and continuing on with it? If it were only one example, I could say maybe that's the case. But here, it's so constant that I feel it has, right, a certain contribution to the narrative. And what I want to propose here is that the text is as if is depicting here in the flipping of the order as if a struggle. It's like a wrestling match here between the two brothers. So Cain is first, he's on top, but then Abel flips him over and then he's on top, and then Cain overcomes and he's first. We got a struggle going on in the text. And I want to propose, right, humbly, that maybe this is also a literary feature used to build up tension between the brothers towards the climax of the act of murder. So to summarize, I've proposed that there are 5 aspects here that build up tension. One, right, the asymmetry in the birth and in the absence of an explanation for Abel's name. The contrasting occupations. The asymmetry in the description of the bringing of the offerings, where there is, right, a description of the nature of the sheep brought by Abel, but no elaboration on the nature of the fruit brought by Cain, and the different responses by God, which obviously leads to tension, accepting one and not the other. And then finally, the flipping over of the ordering of the brothers. I think all this leads to a clear buildup in tension leading up to the murder. And this brings us to the first dialogue. After Cain is really down due to his failure in his offering, where God doesn't heed his offering. So God approaches him after seeing that his countenance fell, he was really down. And the Lord said unto Cain, why art you wroth? And why is your countenance fallen? If you do well, shall it not be lifted up? Tells him, why are you feeling so down? If you'll do better, try better, right, then you will succeed. You'll be lifted up. If you do not do well, sin couches, waits at the door. Right? And if you continue being downtrodden and feeling down, right, getting into a depression, then that'll just lead you to sin. And unto him is your desire. I'm translating using modern English, right? Unto you is its desire, but you will rule over it, which is not very clear as far as its intent, right? It's a translation of ve'elecha trukato ve'atatim sholbo, right? What are we talking about? Your desire is to you, but you will rule over it or him, right? So there are two major possibilities here. It's either that we're talking about the sinful urge, right? The evil nature, right? What's called yetzer hara, the evil nature, right? Wants to try to bring you down, but you have to rule over it. Or what, in my opinion, is more likely, that to you is its desire. It should be translated to you as his desire, right? Namely, we're talking about Abel. To you is his desire. Abel looks up to you as his older brother, right? And you will be able to rule over him, right? If you continue, don't feel down that you failed. You're the older brother, right? He looks up to you, and you'll be basically victorious if you just keep on trying, right? So basically, these words of God are both encouragement and warning. Don't be so down. You just have to try a little harder, and you'll succeed, right? And also a warning: be careful, because if you fall into depression, that just will bring you into further despair and perhaps even harsher, graver consequences. So this is an interesting kind of an encouragement and warning by God. And here I want to raise a question, right? God accepted the offering of one and not the other, but nevertheless he's sensitive to Cain's feeling and trying to encourage him and also trying to warn him, right? So he doesn't deteriorate here. So first of all, why did God not accept both offerings? And I think the answer was given because God doesn't need an offering, but he wants people to be committed and to work him with all their hearts. And that's what Abel did by giving the choicest and the firstlings of his sheep, whereas Cain's worship left something to be desired of. Now, it's not that he was rejected in total. God says, just try to do a little better, and yours will also be accepted, your offering. Now, right, this dialogue shows us that God is not opposed to Cain. He wants him to succeed, and he's trying to encourage him. And he's even trying to warn him of the possibility of sin and deterioration here, warning him that sin awaits at the door, like an animal that waits to prey upon, right? It's prey. So there's sin awaits you. You have to be careful if you're in this depression. Now, the question that I want to raise is, since when do we see God intervening in such a way in trying to prevent human sin? Right? I thought that there's freedom of choice, and and God doesn't intervene in people's choices. And here it seems like God's kind of intervening in the outcome of history and trying to prevent Cain from falling into sin. And that's surprising because we have, many stories of sin in the Bible, but we don't usually see God warning the sinner as he's about to sin. We didn't see God appearing, right, to Eve when she was standing next to the serpent and next to the forbidden tree of knowledge and reminding her, beware, this is a forbidden fruit. No, we didn't see God warning King David as he sees Bathsheba, bathing on the roof. Beware, she's a married woman. That's a severe sin. We don't see those things. We don't see him appearing before the brothers and warning them. right? Treat your brother in a humane way. We don't see that. We see many stories of sin where the sinner, right, transgresses and has to pay the price. Why does God here intervene in this in this speech to Cain, warning him, right? It seems to be intervening in the rules of freedom of choice. It's like the referee has joined sides. How are we to explain this? And I must admit, I haven't seen anybody raise this question, but I find this whole intervention of God before the sin, right, to be kind of not a lot along the rules of freedom of choice. God seems to be intervening here in the personal choices of Cain. And why so? And the answer that I want to propose here is that if we reflect upon what leads to the sin, the murder, well, the answer is clear. There was jealousy, right? But what caused this jealousy? Well, the answer to that is also clear. And that is because God accepted, right, the offering of Abel, but he did not accept the offering of Cain. In other words, if we ask who caused, right, the events that lead up to the murder, the answer is, well, God. Now, I want to emphasize, I'm not blaming God. God, of course, is totally within his lines. Not that I have to say so, but he has right. He's totally has the right to accept one offering and reject another according to what he finds to be favorable in his eyes. But it's actually his reaction to the offerings which brings about that chain reaction, that domino effect that leads to jealousy, that leads to the murder. So perhaps since God is a central player here in generating the events that lead up to the murder, he's the primal cause here, not at fault, but the cause, the generating force here in his reaction to the offerings, so that then he is in his rightful place in trying to prevent the outcome. And because he did not accept Cain's offering, sorry, then he finds it necessary to approach Cain and encourage him. Don't be so down. Try a little better. Be careful not to deteriorate into sin. Hence, what I'm proposing is there's something unique in this story because God is also a central player in the buildup of events towards the sin, and hence he's also trying to prevent the outcome of his own intervention and part in the story. But of course, even that attempt fails, and we now get to the central verse of the whole narrative, and that is the murder. So let us read. And Cain spoke to Abel, his brother. And it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel, his brother, and slew him. Now, everyone who reads this verse senses that something is missing. Because the verse opens by stating that Cain spoke to Abel, right? And the truth is, if we translate the Hebrew, it's Vayomer Cain el Hevel. I would translate, and Cain said to Abel. That would be a precise translation. And Cain said to Abel, his brother, and it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel, his brother, and slew him. Now, the obvious question here is what was said, because it says, and Cain said to Abel, he's not spoke, he said to Abel, his brother, but it doesn't say what he said. Something seems to be missing here from the verse, right? It's as if you're watching like a movie, you're getting watching a Western cowboy movie, and you get to like the showdown, the cowboy, the hero, and the villain are facing up one against the other, and then suddenly the screen loses its sharpness, and you miss out a couple of seconds, and then you see a dead body. Like you missed the whole, right, the highlight of the film, right? This is what's happening here, right? something is said, and then there's murder. We don't even know what happened here. Now, this peculiar lack of information as far as what was said actually is overcome in in the most ancient translation that we have to the Torah, and that is the Septuagint. In the Septuagint, there is something added into the text. Let's take a look here. This is Brenton's Septuagint translation. So if we go to verse 8, let's read it. And Cain said to Abel his brother, "Let us go into the plain," into the field. And it came to pass, when they were in the plain, Cain rose up against Abel his brother and slew him. Now, when you read this verse is perfect, right? Nothing's missing. Cain said to Abel his brother, and there's mention what he said. Let us go out into the plain, into the field. Basically, Cain invited Abel to go out to the field. So here the speech is elaborated. And then when they're in the field, he murders him. Why did he invite him to go to the field? Well, I guess he was in the house. He didn't want to murder his brother before his parents, Adam and Eve. So he tells him, come to the field. And then over there, he harasses him, attacks him, and murders him. But of course, this is what we find in the translation, in the ancient Greek translation. And it's quite likely that this was added by the translator because he sensed that something was missing, right? And this lack of information is picked up by the ancient sages, and they, in their homiletical midrashic approach, try to fill in with missing details. And here I want to just take a little tangent and see how the ancient sages, Chazal, grappled and filled in the missing information for this conversation, what Cain said to Abel, his brother. So I'm reading from the Midrashic compilation of the sages. The sages are the ancient sages of the Talmud. They lived in the first centuries, right, from the first to the fourth, fifth centuries. And here we have one of the older compendiums of their midrashim, their homiletical interpretations that add right information, and they're meant to teach us ideas. It's called Genesis Rabbah or Breshit Rabbah in the Hebrew. So let's read. I have it here both in English and in translation. And Cain spoke to Abel his brother, and it came to pass when they were in the field. So this is the quote of the verse that we read, right, verse 8 in our story. So the rabbis ask, what were they arguing about? What was the discussion here? What did they say to each other? So there are a couple of opinions. Opinion number one, they said, come, let's divide up the world. One will take the land and one will take the movable property. Right, and we can anticipate the farmer, Cain, will take the land, and the shepherd will take the movable property. This one said, so after they divided all the wealth, this one said, the ground you are standing on is mine. So comes the farmer Cain to Abel, and he said, listen, I got the land, you're on my land. The other one said, what you are wearing is mine. I got the movables, and that includes clothing. You're wearing clothing. This one said, take it off. So the shepherd, Abel, told Cain, take off the clothing. What will Cain the farmer tell his brother Abel? The other one said, fly, leave the land, get off the land. Because of this, Cain rose against his brother Abel and killed him. So here we've got like a filling in of the missing conversation, right? And the fight was a consequence of trying to divide the treasures, right, all the wealth that they had. Second opinion is raised by Rabbi Yoshua of Sachnin, a town in the Galilee, right, which used to be a center of Jewish scholarship, right? So Rabbi Joshua of Sachnin said in the name of Rabbi Levi, they both took the land and movable property. No, that wasn't the fight. What were they arguing about? One said, the holy temple will be built in my boundary. The other said, the holy temple will be built in my boundary. Because of this, Cain rose up against Abel, his brother, and slew him. I skipped some of the proofs, but the second opinion of Rabbi Joshua, Yehoshua of Sachnin, is that they started arguing, where will the temple of God be built? Interesting, right? We know that the temple was built in the time of Solomon, right, many thousands of years later. And we skip to another opinion, a third one in this instance. Rabbi Huna said, an extra twin sister was born with Abel. What does that mean? The sages assume that each brother was born with a twin sister. That's to explain how they procreated. We must have females. So they said in the case of Abel, it was a triplet. There was Abel and two sisters. Now this caused some tension. This one said, I will take her because I'm the firstborn. So they started arguing who gets the female, the extra female who was born here. So Cain said, I'm the firstborn, I get her. The other one said, so what did Abel respond? I will take her because she was born with me. She's my twin, right? So triplet, so I get her. She was born with me. Because of this, Cain rose up against Abel, his brother, and slew him. So we've got three opinions here as far as what the argument was. What characterizes these interpretations is they all add a lot of information that doesn't appear in the text, and that's the nature of midrash, homiletical interpretations that aren't bound simply to the text, but allow themselves to expand upon the text. If I would ask you which one would seem most probable, well, I suppose that a lot would probably, or I'd say most closest to the text. I imagine a lot would vote for the first. If I'd ask which sounds most far-fetched, I imagine most would say the second is far-fetched, about where the temple will be built. But if I ask you to reflect upon this, which one is closest to the story itself? Well, I think actually the second one is. Because if we try to relate to this abstractly, I think the rabbis here were picking up on this story and the question of what was said prior to the murder, right, to grapple with a lot larger of a question. And that is, what is the source of tension between humans? What leads to violence? What's the central cause of violence amongst humans? And they deal with this question because this is the first story of violence between humans, the first story of a murder. And there were three possibilities raised. The first was that the major cause of strife and struggle between humans is economic, division of wealth, right? We know that a lot of tension, political tension, a lot of wars revolve around monetary issues, economic issues, trying to take control of natural resources, whether it be fuel, gold, water supply. Very often, struggles are an outcome of economic tension. The second position, that of Rabbi Yehoshua of Sachnin, says, no, it's not economics. It's not this Marxist point of view that it's all an issue of a struggle, economic struggle. No. The major source of tension between humans is religious, ideological. Who is the chosen? Where will the temple be built? Who is God's favored? That is the proposal of Rabbi Yehoshua of Sachnin. He says it's an ideological religious struggle. Reflect upon history. How many of the wars were motivated by religion, right? Religious struggles. Think about it throughout history, whether it be the Crusaders, right? To Christians who attacked the Muslims and fought with the Muslims over control over Jerusalem, or the Inquisition against the Jews in Spain, right? Tensions between Catholics and Protestants, between Muslims and Hindus in India, Pakistan, right? Wherever we look, there's a lot of religious tension, right, between all religions, right? Shiites and Sunni Muslims, and of course, all Muslims against Jews, Christians against Jews, right? As the song goes, and everybody hates the Jews, right? But a lot of it is premised by religious, right, tension. That's the proposal by Rabbi Joshua of Sechnin. He says, where the first opinion would say, if we create, right, a just economic division of a society, then there'll be peace. Kind of a Marxist perspective, right? See how it doesn't exactly work out even in Marxist societies. There's a lot of tension. Second opinion says we got to get out of this ideological religious struggle. Get religion out, right? Imagine a world where there's no God above us, no religion, just love. Sound familiar? That's what John Lennon said. Imagine no heaven, right? Let's take religion out of the picture, right? That's what Rabbi Yoshua of Sechnin is saying. It's all because of religion. By the way, if I'd ask you what's the most violent human century, all right, the most people murdered, it's clearly the 20th century. Well, so far, hopefully it won't get worse, right? And if we look, the two most murderous movements, right, that led to the highest number of fatalities, murders, right? It would probably be the Nazis on the one hand, and on the other hand, we had the Stalin communist regimes that also led to the murder and death of millions who were sent to Siberia. What's interesting about both those movements, they're diametrically opposed. Like communism was looking for trying to break all, different echelons and try to create equality, whereas the Nazis were a movement that tried to say that there's a superior race which has to overcome all the lower races. But there's one thing that was common to both, and that is they were both anti-religious movements. Of course, the communists, Marx saw religion as an opium of the masses, something which is just meant to assuage and calm down the masses. And the Nazi movement was opposed even to the Christian traditions of Germany, and tried to go back to the original Greek, the original German mythologies, all right, and viewed Christianity in a negative way as a form of a Jewish religion that that tries to relate to the weak and the meek. So we can see, even from modern history, that taking out religion, and development of secular societies with new ideologies, whether it be communist, Marxist ideologies, or National Socialist, Nazi ideologies that were both anti-religious, did not bring about peace, to say the least, just worsened the matters. But it's clear that religion is a source of a lot of strife and struggle throughout history, including nowadays. And that leads us to a third opinion, that of Rabbi Huna, who says, what's the source of tension between humans? Well, it's all romantic, right? It's all romantic. It's tensions. Who will get the pretty lady, right? This is a third opinion. The background to the tension is romantic, right? So we have here a thesis, basically, of what causes tension. What were they talking about? This is, of course, the sages using the first story of violence to try to explain and present different proposals for what is the source of violence. Of course, all three have a certain amount of truth to them. We don't have to necessarily elect one of them. But if I had to elect one of them as being closest to our narrative, Well, I think it's clearly the second, because the source of the jealousy here is one of religious nature, right? Whose offering was accepted by God and who was not? Who is the elected by God and who's not? So I think as far as having to determine which one of the three positions here is closest to the narrative, I'd say it's Rabbi Yehoshua, Joshua of Sachnin, right? But all three, I believe, are not really simple readings. They are all homiletical and add information. And in fact, I wouldn't call them pshat, simple readings, because not only do they add information that's not written, but also the actual question that they ask, I think, is not the correct question to ask. Because the rabbis here are asking, what were they arguing about? What did Cain say to Abel? Right? Now, if we go back to our text, the answer to what Cain said to Abel is, well, we simply don't know. The text did not tell us, right, what was said, right? Just said, and Cain said to Abel, and it came to pass. It's missing what Cain actually said to Abel. So the question is, what did Cain say to Abel? Well, it doesn't say so. That's not the question. It doesn't say what he said. That's not the question that has to be asked. We don't know what Cain said to Abel. The question has to be formulated somewhat differently. It's not what did Cain say to Abel, but rather, if the Torah doesn't want to tell us what Cain said to Abel, then why does it preface and say, and Cain spoke to Abel? Just get to the point, right? Skip it out. If you don't want to tell us what Cain said to Abel, skip the opening of the verse and just go to the second part of the verse. And it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel, his brother. Why do you say, and Cain said to Abel, without elaborating what Cain said to Abel? That is the question. I hope you pick up on the difference. It's not what did he say, but rather, why does it say that he said something without elaborating what he said? Now, if I look into some of the ancient or Middle Age commentators, right, and see how they grappled with this question, there's some interesting suggestions. For example, we find one of the interesting commentators by the name of Ibn Ezra, Abraham Ibn Ezra. He's a 12th century, originally from Spain, commentator. And he comments as such in a very succinct comment. He says, on the verse, and Cain spoke. It appears to me that Cain related to Abel the full account of the rebuke with which God had reproached him. What is Ibn Ezra proposing? Let's go back now to the verse. Before verse 8, we had two verses describing the dialogue, right? God approaching and warning and encouraging Cain. So what Ibn Ezra is saying is that the beginning of verse 8, and Cain spoke to Abel, actually states that Cain told him. It's kind of, and he told him, Vayomer Cain el Hevel achiv, and Cain told Abel all that God told him. So it's kind of like Cain coming up to Abel and say, you're so happy about your offering being accepted. Well, let me tell you what God told me. He told me that if I try a little better, then my offering will be accepted. So it's kind of, and he told him. If you will, it might even be preferable to have these words, Vayomer Cain el Hevel achiv, and Cain spoke to Abel, as part of verse 7, and not in the beginning of verse 8. And if we read it that way, as Ibn Ezra, Abraham Ibn Ezra proposes, nothing's really missing, because what was said is stated in the previous two verses, right? And he told them, there's no need to repeat. He told them that God told him so and so. It's enough to just say, and Cain spoke, and Cain told Abel. Vayomer Cain Hevel, that would be a legitimate translation of Vayomer Cain el Hevel. It would be similar to Vayesaper, and he recounted and he told him, right? That could be a legitimate reading of the verse, and hence, according to Ibn Ezra, nothing is missing. That's one approach. Nachmanides, a 13th century North Spain Catalonian commentator who actually left Spain for Israel and reached Israel in the 13th century. Fascinating, brilliant commentator, has a different approach. He proposes that, here we got it, Nachmanides, he says as follows. In my opinion, it is connected with the following words of scripture. And it came to pass when they were in the field, meaning that Cain said to Abel, let us go forth into the field. And there he secretly killed him. What is Nachmanides proposing? Counter to Ibn Ezra, who said, what was said could be understood from what appears previous to verse 8. Nachmanides is proposing that what was said could be understood with what appears immediately following the continuation of the verse. And it came to pass when they were in the field. So Nachmanides says, what is, and Cain spoke unto Abel? You should understand it is as if Cain called Abel. He was in the field and he called him. He's kind of calling him to come to the field. And then when he's in the field, he killed him, which would be very close to what was written in the Septuagint, right? Basically, the Septuagint filled in and said, right, that Cain told him to come to the field, right? And this is what Nachmanides is proposing as his reading of the verse. What was said? He said he told them to come to the field. Here, let's go back to the Septuagint. And Cain said to Abel, his brother, let us go out into the plain, into the field, right? That's exactly what Nachmanides is proposing. And as such, if we go back to our verse and we read it, right, we understand that nothing is missing. Nothing is missing because there's no need to elaborate. It's like, and he called him. You should just translate, and he called him and then killed him into the field. He called to ambush him in the field. So here are two possible explanations. Now, these explanations I would categorize as possible pshat, simple readings. They don't add information, right? According to Ibn Ezra, there's no need to add because it's already stated in the text. According to Nachmanides, Ramban, there's no need to add because nothing was really said. It's just that he called him to the field, right? So these, I think, are two possible readings. What's interesting is Ibn Ezra gets to his conclusion based on what appears prior to the statement, and Cain said to Abel, whereas Nachmanides gets to his conclusion based on what appears following, and Cain said to Abel. I want to propose two other possibilities of explaining the peculiar text here. One is that the Torah purposefully raises, right, our question, what was said, right, leaving it out to inform us that it's simply not important. In other words, the Torah wants to teach us. You're curious to find out, what did Cain say to Abel? What led to the violence? Well, the answer that the Torah has is, it's totally irrelevant. Doesn't matter what he said. Nothing justifies the movement from verbal abuse to physical violence. It could be that Cain said inappropriate things. It could be that Abel was insulting, right? But that doesn't matter. There's no justification. So I won't tell you what was said because it's of no importance and no relevance. Whatever he said, nothing justifies the violence that broke out here. And hence, it's irrelevant. And how does the Torah teach us that it's irrelevant? By arousing our expectation to hear what was said, only to tell us, I withhold this information for you because irrelevant, right? Unnecessary, not part of our evaluation of the behavior, because There's no justification for what happened here. That's one possibility, purposefully leaving it out to teach us that it's not important. And finally, perhaps my favorite explanation, I don't know if you'll like it, but I want to propose perhaps that this is a very sophisticated way of the Torah telling us that what led to the violence here was lack of communication. How does the Torah show lack of communication, misunderstanding? Well, and Cain said to Abel, something was communicated, but the message didn't get through. May have not even reached, or it was not understood correctly. There was a misunderstanding. Abel may have said something, Cain may have said something, and it was interpreted in such a way that Cain didn't even mean. But because of this lack of communication between them, between the brothers, violence broke out. And this is the Torah's way of teaching us of the problems in communication here. Something was said, but it wasn't grasped, it wasn't understood, right? It wasn't absorbed correctly. And this lack of communication is what eventually led to the tragic violence that broke out. So to summarize, we saw three approaches of the ancients that added things to the text. They would be midrashic, homiletical explanations, trying to grapple with what is the source of violence. That's what the sages are grappling with. When we go to the pshat, to the simple reading based on the text, we saw four possibilities. Ibn Ezra, he told him what God told him earlier. Ramban Nachmanides, he called him out to the field to assault him. And then two additional possibilities that I'm raising. Well, first, doesn't matter, and the Torah therefore withholds the information because it's of no consequence. There's no justification for violence. And finally, lack of communication. This is what brought about the ultimate breakout in violence and the murder. So we return now to our reading, and here I want to share with you a nice example of the phenomenon which is called the Leitwort. Leitwort, from the German Leitwort, Leitmotif, sometimes described as a key word, right, in Hebrew, milah mancha, a key word that is repeated. I think here we have a nice example of a key word in the story. And if we read from the murder scene, verse 8, and the dialogue immediately following the murder scene between the Lord and Cain, there's an obvious key word that shows up. Let's read these verses and try to identify that key word. And Cain spoke unto Abel his brother. And it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and slew him. And the Lord said unto Cain, where is Abel your brother? And he said, I know not. Am I my brother's keeper? And he said, what have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries unto me from the ground. And now cursed are you from the ground which has opened her mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. So if I asked you, what is the key word? Well, it's obvious. It's the word brother, right? Look how many times in verse 8, and Cain spoke unto Abel his brother. Now it's very odd. We know that they're brothers, right? Why does the Torah mention Abel his brother? There's nobody else. It's Abel his brother. So maybe you forgot the beginning of the story. But look, in the same verse again, then Cain rose up against Abel, his brother. We know they're brothers, right? Where is Abel, your brother? Well, who else? What other Abel is around, right? Your brother's keeper, fourth time, right? Your brother's blood. Look how many times we see the word brother appearing here. Twice in verse 8, another twice in verse 9, and once more in verse 10, and once again in verse 11. 6 times in a span of 4 verses, we find the word brother. Why emphasize the word brother when it's actually superfluous? The answer, I believe, is clear. The Torah is purposely focusing on this key word, brother, to highlight the severity of the act here, and also to show us how powerful jealousy could be, what jealousy can cause people to do. It could even lead to murder of one's own brother, the one who's supposed to be closest to you. Jealousy can cause you to murder your very own brother. And hence here, I think the Torah uses in a very forceful way, right, that that literary technique of focusing on a word, brother, brother, brother. This is fratricide. This is not only a murder, this is fratricide, the murder of your brother. So we pick up on the dialogue, right? Verse 9, and the Lord said to Cain, where is Abel your brother? Now, obvious that the Lord knows, right? He doesn't need to ask. So why does he ask? So it's not just to open up a conversation here. I think this is a test to see how Cain will respond, right? Will he take responsibility for his action? And let's take a look at the response. And he said, that is, Cain answered, I know not, am I my brother's keeper? He basically responds with a rhetorical question. What are you asking me? Am I I'm his lifeguard, I'm his keeper, I have to know where he is all the time? Now, a rhetorical question, right, has the obvious answer, right? Am I my brother's keeper? I'm not his lifeguard. So the obvious answer as far as Cain is concerned is, no, I'm not supposed to know where he is. Now, why is that such a severe answer? Because not only is it a lie, he knows very well what's with his brother, but it's so severe and highlights the sinfulness of Cain, because what for Cain is a rhetorical question with an obvious answer of no, I'm not my brother's keeper, is in actuality the opposite. Because what is the biblical answer to the question, am I my brother's keeper? Yes, you are. Everyone is his brother's keeper. Everyone has a responsibility towards his brother, right? You definitely have a responsibility towards your brother. There's endless numbers of verses that teach us how you can't, right, ignore your brother's problems. You have a responsibility towards your brother. You have to help him if he's in financial crises, right? You are your brother's keeper. And that highlights how negative the perspective of Cain is, who thinks he has no responsibility for his brother. So it's obvious that Cain failed that test of the Lord. He did not take responsibility, and he also evinced how far off he is with his values. Verse 10, and now God continues to speak, and he said, what have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries to me from the ground. Here we have this image of blood, a pond of blood, right, of the murdered, kind of screaming out, the imagery, the personification of blood, as if it has life and is crying out injustice, right, crying out to the Lord, right, for having been spilt. And some of the ancient commentators, the sages as well, pick up on the use of the plural here, bloods, right? Usually, right, dmei achicha in the plural, and they highlight that why is in the plural bloods, the brothers' bloods in plural, not dam, but rather dmei, which is the plural. Even though that's common in simple reading, but they want to develop the idea when you murder, it's not only the murdered blood that is spilt, but it's also all the possible offspring, all future life that could have sprouted from him that you are murdering, right? And therefore, in the plural, the idea of the severity of murder, right? And this imagery will continue of using blood, the powerful imagery of blood, and many commands that relate to blood. For example, not eating, not being allowed to eat blood, etc., as part of the laws, dietary laws of the Torah. How blood is viewed with sanctity; it belongs to God. Humans don't have any rights over blood, right? And hence they all every sacrifice you're not allowed to eat the blood, and it's thrown on the altar because it symbolizes life. Blood symbolizes life, and here we got the first usage of this imagery of the vitality of blood symbolizing life, calling out to God. And as a consequence, we get to the punishment, right? Now, before we read the punishment, let's ask, for those who have background in biblical law, what would we expect the punishment of Cain to be? Well, what's the typical punishment for murder in the Bible? Many examples throughout the Bible, we see verses that explicitly state that the punishment for murder is death penalty. It's clear that the Bible identifies with death penalty as the appropriate punishment for a murderer, right? Verses such as nefesh tachat nefesh, a soul for a soul, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and also a soul for a soul, a life for a life, right? Shofech dam ha'adam ba'adam damoy shafech. The spilling of human blood by a human shall that blood be spilt. If there's a murderer who spills blood, then his blood should be spilt as well, right? Lo yichupar ki'im bedam shofcho. The blood of an innocent person will not be rectified by anything but by the blood of the murderer himself. There's no way. You can't pay right compensation for spilling blood. That is not accepted. The only appropriate punishment, according to endless verses, I mean, many verses in biblical law, is the death penalty. So here we have the first murder. Let us see the punishment. Verse 11. And now, cursed are you from the ground, which has opened her mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you till the ground, it shall not henceforth give unto you her strength. A fugitive and a wanderer shall you be in the earth. So what is the punishment of Cain? He will become a wanderer, a vagabond. You will not be able to live off the ground. You will be a vagabond, constantly wandering. What happened to death penalty? Now it's very peculiar because the judge here is God himself. Now in the rest of Torah, it seems like the Lord wants the death penalty. What happens when it comes to you? Why is there no death penalty now for the first murderer? I believe the answer can be found within the Torah itself. The Torah makes a distinction. We can find it in the book of Numbers, right? And it states, here, and you give an example, this is the book of Numbers, chapter 35. If somebody in enmity smote him, a murdered person, with his hand that he died, he that smote him shall surely be put to death. He is a murderer. The avenger of blood shall put the murderer to death when he meets him. So if there's a murderer, he is to be put to death, and then there's the relative of the murdered, who will be the one who will actually carry out the penalty, met out the penalty, and put the murderer to death. But look at the continuation. But if he thrust him suddenly, without enmity, or hurled upon him anything without lying in wait, or with any stone whereby a man may die, seeing him not, it was an accident. He didn't see him, he didn't mean, but he happened by mistake to hit him, right? He went hunting and by mistake he hit him and cast it upon him so that he died. And he was not his enemy, neither sought his harm. Then the congregation shall judge between the smiter and the avenger of blood according to these ordinances, and the congregation shall deliver the manslayer out of the hand of the avenger of blood, and the congregation shall restore him to his city of refuge, where he has fled, and he shall dwell there until the death of the high priest, who was anointed with the holy oil. Right? So basically, the Torah in the book of Numbers says there's a death penalty, but only for the right murderer who murdered intentionally. But the accidental murderer, that's what he's called, the accidental murderer, he doesn't deserve the death penalty, and therefore the congregation has to save him and keep him in a city of refuge where he fled to. They've set up these cities of refuge where if somebody accidentally killed another human being, he could flee and be saved within this city of refuge. And this prevented further spilling of blood. Now note, the city of refuge basically meant that if somebody accidentally killed someone, he would have to leave his home and then flee to these cities of refuge. There were 6, 3 on the east of the Jordan and 3 on the west, and live there, and basically no longer remain on his land. Now, if we go back to our story, basically that's what happens with Cain. He is basically expelled from his land and he becomes a wanderer, which leads me to the conclusion that perhaps God related to Cain not as an intentional murder, but rather as an accidental murder. Why so? I believe that this is a consequence of this being the first human death. If there was no precedent, no human has died as of yet, is it correct to view Cain as totally responsible for his actions? If there's no precedent, did he really know what would be the outcome of his actions? I believe the answer is no, and hence God views Cain as an accidental murderer. Hence, as an unintentional murderer, he gets the punishment which is prescribed by the Torah of exile. He's exiled from his land. There may also be additional meaning to Cain's punishment, because remember, Cain was a farmer and he murdered Abel, the shepherd, the vagabond. And perhaps the Torah wants to teach here that when somebody takes another human's life, then he forfeits his own rights over his own life. He loses his life, and his life will now be committed to filling in the gap that he created. He takes the place of Abel now, right? He will now be the wanderer, as Abel was, a vagabond, a shepherd. Cain loses his identity as the farmer, loses rights to settle in the land, and now will become, fill in the shoes of the deceased, of the murdered Abel, his brother. So how does Abel respond to this punishment? We're surprised how lenient it is, but look, so how does Cain respond? And Cain said unto the Lord, my punishment is greater than I can bear. Cain now says, this is too much, this punishment. Behold, you have driven me out this day from the face of the land, and from your face shall I be hid, and I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer in the earth, and it will come to pass that whoever finds me will slay me. So here, Cain says this is too harsh a punishment, surprisingly so. Part of the outcome is he, of course, loses his right to dwell in his land, but he says, from your face shall I be hid. In other words, one of the tragedies of a sinner is that he's distanced from God. I will hide from you. And also, he's distanced from society. And he says in the future, right, I will be a wanderer, and it'll come to pass, whoever finds me will try to slay me, will try to avenge me. I'm an outcast. Two consequences of a sinner who is distanced from his creator and distanced from society. And the Lord said to him, therefore, whoever slays Cain, vengeance shall be taken upon him sevenfold. In other words, basically, God promises that whoever will try to slay you will pay a severe price, sevenfold. And the Lord set a sign for Cain, lest any finding him should smite him. And then there's like a sign that's given to Cain to protect him. Not elaborated what the sign is, the sages in their midrash and their homiletical interpretations propose different possibilities. Was he escorted by a dog who would warn him in advance if somebody was laying in ambush? That's one possibility raised by the sages. And a second one was that he had a sign on his forehead. Maybe that's the source and inspiration for J.K. Rowling's sign on Harry Potter's forehead, right? Something which set him aside and maybe protected him. By the way, this is the source of the term, a mark of Cain, right? Something which is to be embarrassed of, a mark of Cain. However, in this instance, it's actually given as protection, God looking after the sinner and promising him protection. I will make sure that you will not be killed. I still will be with you and protect you, even though you murdered, because you are, right, an unintentional murder, and therefore God promises to protect him, that he won't himself be killed. But we don't know what that sign was. It's just a guarantee of protection. And then the fulfillment of that punishment, and Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod on the east of Eden. So here we see Cain basically being banished and moving towards the east, right, out of where he dwelt. And this is, of course, a motif we saw because Adam and Eve were also banished from the Garden of Eden, right? And they went to the east of Eden, right? Hence the source, east of Eden. And here too, Cain is further banished once again. We have the idea of banishment as a recurring punishment in the beginning of Genesis, Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden, and now Cain, even being banished further to the east of Eden, right, as a punishment. And the continuation, next verses deal with the descendants of Cain, right, his offspring, which we will not read because that's a separate unit within a unit. But let us now skip to the end of the story, the final two verses, verses 25 and 26. And like we said here, the story comes full circle. And there's another son born to Eve, and Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and called him Seth. For God has appointed me another seed instead of Abel, for Cain slew him. Now, once again, we have the birth of a son, his name and explanation for the son. And once again, the English you can't pick up on, but the Hebrew, the name Seth is from the word shvet, which is explained, ki shat li Elohim zeracher, right? Seth is provided, has given me another seed, appointed me another seed instead of Abel, right? For Cain slew him. So Eve here sees this son as some kind of reparation, right, for her loss of Abel, and therefore she gives the name Shet, which means the one who has given me provided me with an alternative son, if you will, and that's the source of the name Seth, right? So we have another birth, another explanation of the name. And of course, this connects us with the original birth of Cain, which was also followed by an explanation. Why Cain? Kaniti, because I have acquired another human, I've acquired a human being. So here, once again, and in both instances, there's a name given, an explanation of the name, and both explanations are related to God, right? So it seems like there's quite a parallel here. Why do I nevertheless state that there's a certain contrast involved? Because we have birth compared to birth, explanation of name, relationship to God. Well, if you look very carefully, you'll note that there's a difference. Because even if in both instances Eve relates this newborn son to God, in this second instance, the name of God is God, right? In Hebrew, Elohim. Let's look at the opening of the story, right? She conceived and bore Cain and said, I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord, not God. That's the translation of Hashem, the tetragrammaton, the holy name, right? This is the holiest name. There's a difference in name, interestingly enough. Elohim, as opposed to Adonai. That's how it's pronounced. We don't read it that way. We don't pronounce the name. It's what's translated sometimes as Yahweh, as far as the letters are concerned. Jews don't pronounce it. I said Yahweh because that's not even the correct pronunciation, right? But we have a different usage of a divine name. This may hint to the difference here. This name, the Lord, the Holy Tetragrammaton, actually relates to closeness of God, whereas the generic name Elohim at the end of the story, Shatli Elohim, here translated God, there's different translations, but in this instance it's God, is a generic name which evinces greater distance. Maybe that the difference in divine name between the opening and closing of the story shows that there's a distancing that has occurred here. Eve feels further distant from God. Why? Well, that's probably one of the outcomes of murder. Blood was spilled, and humans, as a consequence, are distanced from God. Finally, the last verse, surprisingly, doesn't only mention, right, the birth of another son, Seth, but rather goes out of its way for some reason to say, and to Seth, to him also there was born a son, and he called his name Enosh. Then began men to call upon the name of the Lord. Oh, so we have a mention of another son, right? His name is Enosh. And then they began to call upon the name of the Lord. We won't go into interpreting what that means in this instance, but notice a kind of a positive ending, the re-mention of the name Lord, Hashem, the Tetragrammaton, perhaps hoping for some closeness once again to the Lord. Why mention a second generation after Seth? In my mind, that may be related to the structure of the story. Let us remember that the story began with the birth of two sons. Now, it happened to be that there was only one son born to Eve after the murder of Abel, so there's only one vis-a-vis two in the beginning. Maybe to come full circle and close, we need that second generation. So we have 2 versus 2 right here. So this brings the whole story into a nice envelope conclusion, where we have a second son mentioned here, of course, from a different generation, the son that was born into Seth, into Shet, and perhaps also the positive ending, at least once again, the appearance of the name of the Lord, Hashem, closeness to God. So that is the overview of this very short, succinct narrative. And like I wanted to show, how biblical readers have to pay attention to so many minute details, right? We can see how the story is finely structured, and we can appreciate how each detail adds to the narrative, building up tension towards the murder, and even sometimes withholding information also to teach us important ideas and messages. In the first story of of murder, of violence between human beings, the Torah finds it of great importance to recount this and teach us what are the sources and reasons for violence amongst human beings, and how severe the Torah views the spilling of human blood.